Hello, I'm Nicola Chamberlain and I've prepared this presentation for the Equine Clicker Conference 2013 online on a review of positive and negative reinforcement in horses, including a comparative study. In part 1, I will be looking at ethics, welfare and law, how this applies to established learning theory which applies to all mammals, and then how this applies to the current situation that we have with horses. I look at some previous scientific comparative studies between positive and negative reinforcement, specifically in horses, and raise some common points as well as unanswered questions. In part 2, I will be sharing a comparative study of my own, which I undertook in 2012 as part of a dissertation study, and then rounding up with final conclusions and possibilities of where we go from here. So looking first at welfare, ethics and law, it's important to note that scientific knowledge of welfare is constantly evolving. Developments over the last 20 years or so have established that welfare includes an emotional state of well-being. And then I have a quick look at the particular part of the Animal Welfare Act which potentially applies to handling and training of animals, including horses. In ethical and scientific terms, the definition of welfare used to be solely concerned with the physiological welfare of the animal, particularly in terms of providing the essentials for life and not causing unnecessary physical suffering. However, things started to change so that by 1991, Broom described welfare as a measurable state as an individual attempts to cope with its environment. Cope is an interesting word, as coping in an environment doesn't necessarily indicate good welfare, just that an animal is managing somehow not to fall into poor welfare. It is subjective and can occur without physical suffering, indicating that welfare includes a mental state, particularly where an individual lacks control over its environment, and so having some control or choice is important. Since then, it has been pretty well established that welfare encompasses both physical and mental or emotional states of animals, and that positive emotions experienced in animals, as well as humans, is important in terms of well-being, and which advocates positive reinforcement methods when handling or training. In terms of achieving positive emotional experiences, as well as environmental and ecological considerations, positive reinforcement has found to be enriching for captive wild animals and animals in a laboratory setting, not just for maintaining mental health, but also it's been instrumental in implementing effective husbandry and standard veterinary procedures, such as is pointed out by Prescott and Buchanan-Smith, who state, aside from reducing the stress associated with scientific procedures, positive reinforcement training can be integrated into animal management practices to enhance the care and well-being of primates in captivity. Examples of ways of doing this include reducing aggression and improving socialization, reducing or eliminating abnormal behavior, or facilitating health inspection. They also note that training non-human primates to cooperate with routine scientific husbandry and veterinary procedures is recommended as good practice by many legislative and professional guidelines. Despite this, the scientific literature on this topic is sparse and disparate, and training is not used widely as it might be. This may be due to the paucity of information on how to train and its potential benefits. It's unfortunate because training can reduce fear, anxiety and stress. This is an interesting point that I would like us to hold on to and take forward with us through this presentation. The British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums, a governing body and partner of the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, produce guidelines on the management of various zoological species, and which also widely advocate the use of positive reinforcement. For example, their guidelines relating to captive elephants specifically state that husbandry procedures should be trained using only positive reinforcement methods, particularly for elephants that have a tendency to display aggressive behaviours, and only positive reinforcement with very mild negative reinforcement for other, more emotionally stable elephants. I think most of us are also now generally aware that positive reinforcement is widely recommended in the training of companion animals, such as dogs. Gone are the days where the Barbara Woodhouse method of using a choke chain to sharply check a dog that isn't walking nicely on a lead are deemed as generally acceptable by the public and trainers, although we all know aversive methods are still being used by some. So looking now at law, the Animal Welfare Act 2006 is the biggest piece of animal welfare legislation in England and Wales since 1911. But what does this say about the use of appetitives or aversives in handling or training? In reviewing this, I'm aware that this conference has an international audience, and so forgive me if this does not apply to you, but it would be an interesting part of any discussion afterwards to hear about this from an international perspective. Unlike previous legislation, the Animal Welfare Act imposes a duty of care on any person responsible for an animal. This means that the duty extends to preventing suffering rather than before, where it was only an offence was committed after suffering had occurred. It applies to all vertebrates, which include horses. The Act provides that it is an offence to fail to take reasonable steps to ensure the needs of an animal are not met to the extent required by good practice in terms of general management and environment. But the bit we are interested in, that potentially includes training and handling, is contained in section 9(2)(e), which states that the animal's needs include to be protected from pain, suffering, injury and disease. As we have seen earlier, the scientific definition of suffering includes mental and emotional welfare. But what interpretation will be used in court when assessing section 9? The Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, or DEFRA, is the government body in England and Wales enforcing animal welfare. It has various guidelines across various species which provide more practical information for caregivers and owners as to what will be taken into consideration when assessing a prosecution under the Animal Welfare Act. Its code of practice for the welfare of dogs, for example, states, only use positive reward-based training. Avoid harsh, potentially painful or frightening training. This gives us a clear intention of the interpretation of section 9 in relation to dogs. I have chosen dogs because they are a companion animal which undergo a significant amount of human-animal interactions and which require a lot of training in order to be part of our lives. Although there are differences which should be considered, horses also now considered as companion animals, with over 90% of horses in the UK being kept for leisure purposes and which are frequently handled and trained. However, the Code of Practice for the Welfare of Horses states, horses respond best to a firm but gentle approach. What does this mean? It's hardly scientific terminology, but it would be reasonable that most people would assume that it is advocating the use of negative reinforcement and therefore positive punishment, albeit not too severely. Isn't this incongruous with what we have already been discussing? Why is this the case? This incongruity may be explained by the part of section 9 of the Animal Welfare Act which states, to the extent required by good practice. How do we know what good practice is? Is good practice considered traditional good practice? If so, we know this is based on negative reinforcement and positive punishment. And what about natural horsemanship? Well, this is also predominantly based on negative reinforcement and positive punishment. Science tells us that good practice for all vertebrates includes providing choice and the use of positive reinforcement and negative punishment, as well as other ethological and environmental considerations. As we have seen, good practice for other species, such as those found in zoos or used in laboratory research, is set out in legislation and governing bodies or organisations. Those organisations base their good practice on scientific research. Indeed, the DEFRA guidelines are also based on selected scientific research, and which will lead us in a minute to have a look at the research specific to horses, which should give us an indication as why DEFRA believe that negative reinforcement is best for horses. But in looking at the research, we need to ask ourselves, is negative reinforcement better for controlling horses? Does it produce better training results, better safety considerations, better welfare? And isn't welfare the crux of the Animal Welfare Act? And as a leisure companion animal, is it better for the human-horse relationship? This slide provides just a quick recap on the 4 quadrants of learning and how this not only affects operant learning, but also associative or classical or Pavlovian conditioning. I won't go into this in too much detail here, but you can always pause this video and have a closer look if you need to. Very basically, positive reinforcement is the addition of an appetitive that makes the operant behaviour more likely to occur. With that comes associative conditioning related to pleasurable emotions. The removal of an appetitive or negative punishment is most likely to bring about frustration and possibly other negative emotions. In contrast, negative reinforcement is the addition of an aversive, where the associative emotion is again negative, such as fear, anxiety, or frustration. This is closely linked to positive punishment. It is also worth recapping on how important timing and how clear or salient cues for a behaviour, or contiguity and contingency, are to learning. In the 1960s and 70s, Seligman undertook a series of experiments where dogs were placed in a context where they received inescapable shocks. Quite soon they gave up any attempt to escape the shocks and just laid down and remained still, even when the level of the shock was significantly increased. The dogs were termed as being in a state of learned helplessness. However, dogs that had been allowed to escape the shocks originally, but were then put in an inescapable scenario, continued to attempt to escape even though there was none. These experiments were replicated in other animals and humans, albeit with aversive noise, and the same results occurred. These experiments in animals would not be condoned today, but it is postulated that learned helplessness or shut down or transient learned helplessness occurs in horses more regularly than we would like as a result of inescapable aversive handling. Mills identified many behaviour problems in horses, such as a behaviour inhibition or dead to the leg, or aggressive flight-based behaviours due to negative reinforcement and positive punishment causing deleterious emotional effects. It's interesting to note that, specifically talking about horses, Mills concludes, opportunities for positive reinforcement should be sought. These teach the animal specifically what is required, and there are more ways of getting something wrong than getting it right. I'd like to have a look at a few of the scientific studies that specifically relate to equine learning theory. You will remember that this has importance not just from an interest perspective, but it is the science upon which guidelines for best practice and legislation are made. In theory, what helps make opinion. McGreevy, when reviewing the prominence of negative reinforcement in equitation, described it as the removal of an influence, but it is important to note that the influence itself is aversive. This is already potentially blurring the lines of the foundation science we already know. He also states that it is the failure to release the pressure that is bad, and which is at least part of the story. Miller and Lamb in 2005 and Burke in 2008 concluded that firm but gentle approach should be readily advocated in equitation. This is the same wording used in the DEFRA code. Again, when we look at the studies that have been done, we need to look at whether negative reinforcement is best for several different aspects, from control and safety to welfare, efficacy, and the human-horse relationship. And in addition, we should also look at why we should not be using positive reinforcement with our horses. We know that it is adding an appetitive and therefore rewarding, but withholding it can be negative punishment, and the classical conditioning that can go with that means that it can lead to frustration behaviours. Bassett and Buchanan-Smith concluded that continued unpredictability of an appetitive is likely to be detrimental to welfare, and which we should be aware of when using it. However, in positive reinforcement, Mills did not see this to be a problem, provided the other aspects of learning theory, including specificity, contiguity of reward, and contingency of the cue stimulus, were adhered to, in which case positive reinforcement should be used as much as possible in equitation. So looking at some of the published peer-reviewed comparative experiments, first of all, Warren, Smith and McGreevy compared negative reinforcement alone with a combination of negative and positive reinforcement when training the simple task of halt. They found there was no difference on latency to halt, i.e. there was no difference in efficiency of either training method. However, a blended reinforcement led to less frustration and anxiety behaviours, and so adding positive to negative reinforcement may improve welfare. In the following year, in 2008, Helesky et al. Compared the same combination of negative reinforcement only and combined positive and negative reinforcement in a potentially aversive task of walking over a tarpaulin. It's interesting to note that more negatively reinforced horses failed the task altogether, although this was not statistically significant. It's important to remember that when testing for statistical significance, your sample size must be representative of the population you are wishing to study. There are 34 horses used in this study, which is not unusual for studies into equine behaviour, but there is a possibility here that a more representative sample size may have given a different result for statistical significance. Again though, adding positive reinforcement was found to make the task safer and easier for the handler due to less unwanted behaviours being displayed. Innes and McBride published their findings in relation to a straight negative reinforcement versus positive reinforcement study, which they undertook with 16 ponies that had been rescued from a welfare situation and which had received little or no handling prior to the rescue procedure, which is likely to have been aversive for them. These ponies were trained to perform several more complex tasks than the last two studies over a 7-week period. Statistically significant differences were found, despite the small sample size, in that positively reinforced ponies came closer to a novel and therefore potentially aversive object in arena tests. Negatively reinforced ponies were found to display more fearful behaviours and were more reactive than their counterparts, and I'm sure you'll agree that this is an important safety factor when you're riding out and a plastic bag in the hedge suddenly comes to the attention of your horse. However, although not statistically significant, unlike the previous study, positively reinforced ponies were found to be more likely to achieve the correct operant response. As an aside, more positively reinforced ponies met the criteria, whatever they were, for rehoming post-study. It is likely those criteria were based on the horse's association to humans or how friendly, non-aggressive they were. So, an overview of these few studies, and there aren't that many to choose from, is that positive reinforcement decreases anxiety stress behaviours, improved motivation, potentially made it more likely that the operant task would be achieved, although this is very subjective from these studies, improved perception of the environment and potentially people, noticeably improved welfare, and made horses safer to handle. The conclusions that I draw from my literature review are that there is substantial evidence to support the predominant use of positive reinforcement in handling and training of just about all vertebrates. There is still a common perception at all levels that this does not apply to horses, albeit there is some scientific evidence to support this. The evidence we do have is inconsistent in many regards, but there is an overriding message that positive reinforcement, used correctly, is better for welfare and has potential for making handling, training and riding horses safer. There may yet be species-specific considerations in terms of application, and I go back to the point made by Prescott and Buchanan-Smith earlier, that positive reinforcement may not be in wide use in horse management due to a lack of information or understanding as how to train with it or apply it to equitation. In any event, whether using negative or positive reinforcement or both together, there are potential pitfalls if close attention is not made to careful application and assessing what and how much is appetitive or aversive on a subjective basis, as pointed out by Mills. However, further quality scientific evidence can help to resolve the current confusion, but which should be carefully scrutinised in view of the substantial evidence obtained on other species. Such further studies may be necessary for there to be a wholesale review by the powers that make important recommendations or policy-making decisions such as DEFRA or Parliament, or even to prick the ears of more equestrians and equestrian organisations. That concludes part 1 of my presentation. Hopefully part 2 will be a little easier going when I will go through a summary of an experiment undertaken last year where I undertook a comparative study of Pirelli style training versus clicker shaping training. There will be some video footage and I will hopefully be answering some further questions raised in this part of the presentation, as well as considering where we might go from here and my own personal conclusions. A list of references can be made available upon request. Thank you for listening, and I hope to catch up with you in part 2.